is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott here with Andrew Young. Andrew, at the beginning of this year, we talked a lot about some of the key themes and ideas that we thought were going to drive the crypto market in 2024. Some of those themes have come true. Others maybe we're waiting to see play out. But one of the great perspectives that we have on the show is that we can get some of the best investors in the space to join us. We've had, Charlie Morris from CMCC and others on the show to tell us their thoughts. And today we're very, very lucky because we've got two folks who've been at this for a very long time, both in a formal sense, but also in an informal sense, investing in the space. And that is Avichal Garg and Ken Deeter, who are respectively the co-founder and general partner and a partner at Electric Capital. Electric Capital is one of the leading investment firms in the space, crypto VC firm, investing in many well-known layer 1 platforms, layer 2 platforms, DeFi protocols, NFT projects, DAOs, developer tools, and other forms of crypto businesses. They love to find iconic crypto founders at the early stage and support them all the way through. And that's something that we really resonate with as a show that has hosted a lot of founders, and we know how valuable great investors can be. So Avichal and Ken, thank you so much for joining the show. You guys released a developer report in, I think it was January of this year, which had some really interesting findings that we want to dig into on the show, including some sort of key themes that you're watching. But first, it would be great if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Electric. Ken, why don't you kick it off?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Ken, obviously. I'm one of the partners here at Electric. I'm actually an engineer by training. Spent a bunch of time at Facebook and VMware before even thinking about being on the investing side. Met Avichal and Curtis, who's the other founder of Electric, along the way. And I've been doing this for about 6 years now. I'm mostly focused on DeFi stuff these days.
That question around timing and the technology and what the challenges are on the ground is I think very relevant for this particular moment, because we're in this period in time where there seem to be several technologies that are all hitting an inflection point at roughly the same time. It's not that they're new. In fact, some of them are quite old, right? And I'm referring to basically like blockchain, AI, and extended reality, if you like. These are all things that, if anything, blockchains have been around for the least amount of time, right? They've only been around since 2008, 2009. AI has been around since, Alan Turing and the Turing test. But they all seem to be, if we were looking at an S curve, sort of hitting a key inflection point at the exact same moment. And I think that that's, to my knowledge, unique in history. Like there have been lots of times where there's been, the internet or the transistor or, the TV or something like that, but not one where all these things are hitting the inflection point. But the devil's in the details. Like there's still plenty of implementation challenges in each of those different areas. It's not like we're now, at escape velocity. Well, we may be escape velocity, but we're still lots of challenges, right, left to resolve.
Yeah. And the pattern is actually not, like people always like to say, oh, like, we're going to be buying our coffee on crypto, or like, we're going to be, I don't know, having meetings on AR or whatever. Generally speaking, the pattern is never that the new thing just like directly replaces the existing thing, as sort of its first use case. It always finds something else. And so I think, kind of to what Avichal was saying, that creativity and that optimism and that kind of looking for novel uses of the technology to solve problems in entirely new ways, that is a very sort of engineering mindset. Creative mindset.
So I do want to sort of turn to the market now. Like what are the sort of big narratives do you guys see coming up in kind of 2024, maybe early 2025, that people aren't really talking about right now as much as they should be? Obviously, like the market right now, meme coins are doing really well. There's a lot of hype around eigenlayer restaking, decentralized AI, which seems quite a bit too early, but is also very hot. But I'm just kind of curious, like, what are you guys kind of investing in right now that you think is sort of underappreciated by the market?
Underappreciated is an interesting question. In some sense, the way we think about it is a little less narrative oriented and is a little bit more, what does the technology let you do that you couldn't do before kind of oriented. And then at certain points in time, the technology kind of tips and all of a sudden becomes useful and interesting. And so, our base case, if you go back, I wrote this paper in 2017, I think. I say like end of 2017, and it was called the programmable money thesis. And kind of our lens on it was that what these L1s were really going to let you do is, if at that base layer you sort of assume that there's a sort of an emerging store of value, or potentially what we now call stable coins, like the US dollar rails, that you could write code around them. And by natively being able to custody assets and things like smart contracts and wallets, and being able to write code around it, you would unlock the entire financial system. And so, if you think about wills, trusts, escrow, REITs, HELOCs, mortgages, derivatives, securities, like all of these things fundamentally are basically, here's a pile of money, here's some access rules around who can access that money, and then here's some rules about where the cash flow off that thing goes, and how you sort of control that. And all of a sudden now you have this new infrastructure that lets you sort of do that. And then a lot of the sort of things that happen downstream of that come from those properties. And so we're looking at things like what happens as this stuff tries to scale. And so you have the modularization of this stack. And so we're investors in things like Espresso and Eigenlayer, which enable sort of throughput and so I think we still think there's a lot of infrastructure work to do. It's still pretty early days. Ken can speak a lot about DeFi. I think there's still a ton of DeFi activity, kind of like first gen DeFi was kind of skeuomorphic. And I think we're now starting to see second or maybe even third gen DeFi, which is like really novel and interesting stuff. Obviously, the multi-chain is a thing. We've long believed that. We're investors in multiple L1s very early, and are very active in the Near ecosystem and the Solana ecosystems, and various L2 ecosystems on top of E. The NFT ecosystem is very, very interesting. You can sort of think of those as digital goods or digital property rights, starting with things like PFPs and collectibles. We're investors in Magic Eden, which is, if you look in a cross-chain, across Bitcoin, ETH, Solana, they're the number one NFT marketplace. And so we've long believed in that, and we think that's going to be huge. The AI stuff is interesting, actually. I think there's a lot of applications of cryptography and distributed systems. So there isn't actually, we don't spend a ton of time thinking about narratives. We spend a lot of time thinking about, does the tech let you do a thing that you just couldn't do before? And if that's true, odds are a lot of people eventually will want to do it. And in some sense, actually, maybe last thought, we kind of want to focus on the things that are not going to be in the narrative cycle, or not obviously in the narrative cycle, kind of by the nature of what we're trying to do, which is you want to invest off cycle, right? Like people talk about, oh, what's the trend? Can you catch it? But by the time you realize it's a thing, you're really chasing it. And so like if you're making those kinds of investments today and trying to get to market really fast, odds are, like, can you really get a team off the ground, become experts in a thing, have that thing launch? If there's going to be a token network, launch the token network in like 6 months and then ride the wave. It's like, that's a very short term way to get a thing off the ground. And so really the people who are going to benefit from this cycle, like, Near right now is benefiting from this sort of like distributed AI, decentralized AI sort of narrative, because Ilya was one of the authors on that Transformer paper that ultimately led to LLMs. But he's been working on that for years, right? It's that's not a thing that you could, like, if you try to bootstrap that overnight, it's probably a flash in the pan meme coin and it's gone. Whereas Near has spent the last 5 years just building really, really amazing tech, and Ilya spent his entire career becoming an expert in AI. So in some sense, we try to like tune out the narratives a little bit, because we want to think about what could be possible in 3 or 4 years, and then the narratives in 3 or 4 years, who knows, right? It's just too hard to predict.
Yeah. I'd add to that a little bit. I actually, Avichal will recognize me start saying this all the time. I actually think we're probably like a little over pivoted on adding block space right now. And, to Avichal's point, like Shriram and Eigenlayer folks, they've been working on this for years. The Espresso guys have been working on it for years. OP and Arbitrum, those were sort of like end of like last cycle kind of timings that they got started. So they're working on it throughout the whole bear market. The Arbitrum guys have been around for forever at this point. I
actually just saw a tweet this morning from Ed talking about how, like, what were to become, I think, validity proofs he was working on 10 years ago. I think he just
exactly
tweeted about it, right?
Right. Yeah, so crypto has this way of like, creating these narratives that like drive the market. But, I think actually right now, applications are probably more, we have tons of block space now. We have probably 10x, maybe even 100x block space that we had last cycle. We have all these L2s, and, we have to stop sort of like copy and pasting DeFi protocols everywhere. We need to come up with some new things that use this block space in interesting ways. And so, while I'm not a huge fan of Friendtech, I think Friendtech was an interesting example where cheap block space plus, privy type style, like quick logins plus PWAs on mobile apps, like that created this combo of stuff that suddenly, created a new distribution channel and a new growth method for new types of crypto apps. I think, Farcaster and some of the stuff that's happening over there is also, at early signals of these type of things. And so, yeah, I'm actually really looking towards people kind of being creative and experimenting with new types of applications at this point.
Yeah, I want to build off of that and something Avichal said earlier, which is that a lot of the early applications in DeFi were skeuomorphic, and I think Ken, you alluded to that as well. Whenever these new technologies come along, it's certainly true for the web. When the web came along, it was, well, this is a medium for presenting information. So what information can we put online? We can put newspapers and magazines and classifieds and so forth. And it wasn't until much later that we realized there were much deeper, more profound, kind of weirder uses for this technology, social media, cloud computing, and so forth. And I feel like the same thing is true today when it comes to blockchain and AI. Like even with AI, if you ask consultants, it's this, you can replace all your whole call center with AI bots. And like, that might be true, but probably this is going to have a much deeper and more profound impact on the world than just replacing, call center personnel. And I think probably like any other technology, it'll create a lot more jobs than it destroys. But that's a side point. But let's talk about DeFi, Ken, because that's your focus. And this idea that the first era of DeFi was skeuomorphic. That's something I don't totally understand, only because what I mean by that is, like, the way I think about DeFi is reimagining functions of finance from the ground up, from first principles, in a peer-to-peer way, right? So without the need for traditional intermediaries. And this idea that, most assets are just money with some rules around it. Another way to think about that I think about it, at least, is like a lot of securities are just contracts, really. They're legal language that gives you a right to some thing, a share of a common enterprise, a stream of cash flows, whatever. And so all of that can be digitized. So I just want to understand, I'd love to just dig in deeper on the DeFi front. I'm a financial guy by background, and so I'm just fascinated by what's been built already, but also what you think the future looks like. What is the frontier of DeFi to you?
Yeah, let's see. It's a lot of different ways you can take this conversation. But maybe just starting at the beginning. Like the stuff that we saw in the beginning were, almost one-to-one mappings of existing, I would call it TradFi marketplaces and structures, right? So like on early Ethereum, we tried to do order book dexes, right? And yeah, it gets rid of the middleman, but it turns out architecturally not the right thing to do, given the throughput of the chain. I would say probably like the first sort of like native weird DeFi thing was probably AMMs, right? Like, to any sort of TradFi person, like having such a simple pricing function that can be, is on the wrong side of the arb most of the time, is sort of like, why would you ever do that? But, in the compute constrained environment on chain where, having composable liquidity like that is like really, really valuable, that you might actually pay a premium or be willing to tolerate a less efficient mechanism to do that. It is actually a thing. And then once you have that, then you can start building lending markets on top of that automatically liquidate. And, you start to build all these infrastructural pieces. So, I think there's still a lot of these things where, we've probably figured out some of the really core basic financial services like swapping and lending. But even within AMMs, there's all kinds of different curves and formulas that people are thinking about. How do you try to minimize impermanent loss? Can you take external price signals to make the pricing more efficient? There's a lot of these kind of like fundamental improvements. There's a project in the Curve ecosystem called Curve USD, and its related project called Llama Lend. There's this idea that you can actually use an AMM combined with a lending market to sort of like have have the arbitraging activity automatically like liquidate positions for you along the way, which is like a very kind of fascinating DeFi native idea. The Frax guys are sort of extending that with this thing they call the BAM, which is basically a full AMM where you're using the unused liquidity in the AMM pool to like lend with. And it sort of has this like similar property as soft liquidations in your curve. And these are like pretty interesting mathematical constructs that, we really only have developed in, I would say, like the last year. And so, to me, this feels like sort of, we're kind of in the, like, I don't know, the iPhone 3G kind of era, maybe iPhone 4 kind of era, where we're like, hey, wait a minute, like we can do these things that, that like the combination of these types of services into one construct is not a TradFi thing, for various reasons. And because it's software and like, we don't have the same sort of like, oh, is it too many eggs in one basket? Is it too few people controlling too many parts of the financial ecosystem? We don't have those concerns when it comes to verifiable software, that we can start exploring some of these interesting design spaces that, I think crypto uniquely enables.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things as well, kind of in DeFi, has been how the staking yield almost represents like a risk-free rate within the ecosystem. I do think that is a big, over the last, interesting over the bear part of this cycle. One of the key changes is that now we have access to the sort of the off-chain risk-free rate through these stable coins that have the treasury yield access. And that's actually a meaningful yield now, right? And then, like, as you said, ETH staking and then now restaking. DeFi is still figuring out how to orient itself around these core assets that are yield bearing. That was not a thing in the last cycle. Everything was like ETH or USDC. And now we have this, we have to rethink how, stable swap works, because stable swap is now not between, ETH, one kind of ETH and another kind of ETH. Now it's between ETH and this yield bearing ETH. And how do you price that as you go forward? And, all these kinds of questions that come downstream of that. And how do you use yield bearing collateral? And so, I think we're starting to see like pretty good attempts at adapting some of the ideas to this, but it's still definitely work in progress. Mm-hmm. So one of the things too, because you mentioned Frax, and I think what's really interesting with Frax is they're launching their own like Frax chain, or I think it's called Fraxtal, in the next kind of couple upcoming weeks, I think, or maybe a couple months. And this sort of delves into what you were talking about earlier about building too much block space. I'm curious what you think on the DeFi application side. Do you think do you think the future is DeFi applications going cross-chain onto all these different L1s? Or do you think increasingly some of these DeFi applications are going to kind of do what Frax does and essentially build out their own sort of like app chain or chain ecosystem? I guess we've debated a lot on kind of like, what does the future of DeFi look? Is it or maybe it's a combo of both, I guess. So it's interesting.
Certainly, there are a lot of teams. Like, I feel like I have a conversation every week with the DeFi team that's like, I'm going to build an L2. Certainly, like I said earlier, that's where the market narrative is today. A lot of teams feel like, they can raise bigger funding rounds if they speak that way. Over the long sort of that played out to its logical extreme, I'm somewhat skeptical of, because often DeFi protocols ultimately are downstream of liquidity and like real forms of yield bearing risk that are in that ecosystem, right? And so if you go too verticalized, then I do think you kind of cut yourself off from the rest of the world, or it becomes difficult to attract all the liquidity from various things. One of the interesting things that's happening right now is that I think the USDB on Blast right now is actually depegging a little bit. And the interesting thing there is, right, Blast plays this, they're kind of like natively like staked assets and yield bearing assets in their ecosystem. And so if you're another stablecoin looking in, you could probably bring stablecoin liquidity onto that chain. But like, what's your incentive, right? Like you're sort of not the anointed stablecoin there, and you're going to be at a disadvantage. So, does that cause a distortion within the Blast ecosystem that makes their stablecoin not work as well and make it difficult for them to attract liquidity? Like, these are these real kind of like ecosystem questions that I think DeFi protocols need to figure out over the long time. So unfortunately, I don't have like a a rule of thumb kind of answer for that. But one other interesting observation is that we have seen that at least when it comes to the base assets and any chain, so ETH and Ethereum or Solana and Sol and Solana, those kinds of assets, the bridging activity of those assets between different ecosystems seems relatively thin. Less than you might have expected, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. And so I think that suggests that at least at some level, there is sort of like a verticality to these communities that, you need to, if you're building into ETH, it's very hard to then credibly build into Solana or have a cross-chain Solana ETH kind of activity, because these are different pools of capital, they're different communities, they're different ecosystems. And, I think that's also going to play out in how DeFi protocols think about horizontal expansion.
Yeah, for sure.
One thought on this,
oh yeah, go ahead.
I think there's actually a framework here, like if you look at other markets, that is worth thinking about and considering. So I sort of have this, if you think about like the user value chain, there's sort of the user on one end of the spectrum, all the way on the other end of the spectrum is infrastructure, like hard infrastructure. So you can look at any market this way. So you could look at, let's say, mobile phones. There's like the iPhone, right? The product that you buy at the Apple store. There are a bunch of systems integrators in the middle. And then all the way on the other end of it is like TSMC and like the fabs that actually like print the chips, right? And all of the value capture. So if that's the horizontal, if you put a y-axis on it and say, where's the value capture? Like who makes all the money? What you notice is it's a U-shape, right? So like Apple makes all the money and like TSMC can make all the money and the people in the middle just get squeezed. Because the real points of leverage are either owning the user or owning like the hard CapEx heavy infrastructure. Like you have to own tens of billions of dollars worth of assets to be able to compete. And I think crypto is going to work the same way. So all the way on one end of it is sort of like Binance and Coinbase. They own the end user, KYC users. All the way on the other end is like Bitcoin and Ethereum. You would need tens of billions of dollars of CapEx costs to really be able to compete at this point. And like really simple DeFi protocols that are like truly just smart contracts are somewhere in the middle. And so I think you're going to get this U shape again. And if you believe that, then I think what you have is an incentive for people that are in the middle to try to move to the edges, right? And try to move up the value curve. So what does that mean? So that means somebody like Uniswap has to try to own the front end and they have to build a relationship with the customer. So they have to build mobile apps. I wrote about this back in like 19 or 20. And it makes sense for people who have protocols to try to build L2s. That's effectively moving up the other side of the curve, right? They're trying to actually move into deeper and deeper infrastructure and control the layers underneath them, to the point where you could imagine, I mean, in the limit, I don't think it's going to happen, but you could imagine take something like Solana. Let's say there's like one killer app on Solana, right? And it's like 80% of the people that use Solana use this thing. Is it so crazy for that thing to say, wait a second, we should just build our own L1? Like we can optimize it for our use case and we can like change the VM to do what we need to do, and so on and so on. And so then they ultimately move into the L1, right? You can see that like the power dynamic and the incentive structures in that direction, or it's in the other direction, which is, hey, look, if I already have the user, can't I just give them another product and essentially remonetize them? This is why you tend to see like fintechs remonetizing users all the time. And so is it so crazy that if I own the end consumer, that I give them another product? And so I could have, a lending product and a stable coin, and some perps protocol, and you can just move around in that, and then you get some really nice efficiencies. You get gas efficiencies, you get sort of like cross margining. There's like a bunch of cool stuff that you might get as a result that's actually beneficial to the user. So I think the market forces are sort of going to pull people in these two directions, and then it's a question of what do the teams want to do. Now the big thing we talk about internally is, well, does the fact that this stuff have built-in interoperability, and in some cases if it's in the same L1 or L2, you actually have true interoperability, composability, not just interoperability, you get composability as well. Does that change anything? Does that actually mean that teams will sort of pair up in interesting ways, like do token swaps? And Ken has some like really interesting ideas around this. We have like a much looser coupling. So it's not just you get one company, but you sort of get these like loose couplings of ecosystems that sort of can own and recycle users in a sense. That is, I think, what's unique about crypto. And so maybe there's an argument here that the infrastructure does do different things. But I think there's going to be, for most teams, there's actually a very natural tension to try to remonetize and build a bunch of different verticals of products and remonetize the user, or to try to go deep in the infrastructure and try to like build that way. And so I think we're just going to see a lot of that until you see some big winners.
Yeah, that's a really great insight, and it's actually interesting because we one of our investors, Dan Pulitzer, has talked a lot about sort of Uniswap building out Unichain. And like one of the interesting things there is like they could essentially, they could effectively cut their fee on the app because they're monetizing through the chain level. It's actually one of the things like we're doing with like my own startup. So that is really interesting. I think it's interesting too to think like one of the teams that's actually doing this to the extreme is Bear Chain, for example, where they're building like a EVM compatible Cosmos chain, and then they're building actually like 4 or 5 of the main sort of DeFi protocols themselves. So things like lending protocol, a DEX, a perps platform, I think a liquid staking as well. So it's interesting to see all these different, almost like the new generation of L1s. It does feel like we're very firmly in kind of like at least the early middle stages of like what I call like the Gen 3 of L1s, where like, Ethereum was first era, second era, where it's all about scalability, but still sort of, I would say, generic to a certain extent. And then now we're sort of experimenting with like L1s that have applications built directly into it, kind of things like Osmosis, DYDX, all that.
Yeah. My mental model has always been sort of, we're like creating countries, like little countries, digital countries here, and each of them have their own kind of like economic, like development model, right? So you might have the sort of like fully state-owned enterprise, like, Marxist model, if you want to call it, that versus like the kind of like totally wide open, Wild West, like capitalist model and various points in between, right? And we've never had a time where we've been able to explore this design space in parallel all at the same time, with like 100 different points. And so that ultimately that's kind of what I think we're all collectively doing here. But sort of to the other question, like building a business in the US versus building a business in Europe versus Japan are also meaningfully different things. And it's not like the same business can easily port over. Sometimes there's different sources of capital, there's different customs. And I think a lot of actually the behavior that I see between DeFi ecosystems and different chains kind of has that feel to it as well these days.
So I have a question on that point, which is that, like, is that a good thing? I mean, it's cool that we get to explore the design space and everyone gets to do their own version of a digital sovereign, whatever. But at the same time, like part of the promise of this was that there would be composability between, platforms and applications, and that would lead to more liquidity and more access for the end user and more functionality. And I wonder, like with all these little fiefdoms popping up that each have their own rules and cultures and so forth, if that is good, bad, or sort of a neutral thing, I guess it is what it is, towards the some sort of ultimate end goal, which is, can this enable business models, new markets, new capability that wasn't possible before for everyone to access, right? Or is it in some way perpetuating a form of balkanization that already exists in the real world? I don't know. How do you think about that?
My instinct is, well, one, it is what it is.
Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah.
The reality of it. And I think it's one of the interesting things too about the space is like the path dependency of like what hits first and what gets traction first and what that means downstream. So there's sort of like theoretically what should happen, and then there's in practice how users and humans behave, which are not necessarily in sync. But I think it's sort of A, it is what it is, but B, I think it's net probably good. I don't think we're not going to end up with intermediaries. I don't think we have 100% selfless people that don't want to make money. I think people will be selfish and self-interested, and like that's just human nature, right? So a lot of those things that sort of cause people consternation about the legacy systems, I don't think the humans are any different just because the technology is different. So a lot of those motivations will be similar. What I think is compelling about all of these new components, though, is that ultimately they're much more transparent, and you have portability of assets because you have ownership of your assets if these are built in the right way. And so what I think you get is more accountable protocols and more accountable companies because there's the threat that you could just take your assets and leave, right? So if you compare, let's say, Coinbase or Binance to like Bank of America or Schwab, the ease with which you can just withdraw all your assets and take them somewhere else it sort of looms over them, right? And so I think they can't be as exploitive to their customers as some of the legacy institutions can be. And I think the protocols are even more on an extreme, which is I think it's so easy to switch between a protocol because you're already custodying all your own assets. And I think like the next gen ZK stuff where it's truly self-custodial and you can like batch transactions and you don't even have to hand over your assets. The friction to leaving, I think, creates a market pressure where the founders and the protocols have to treat the users even better. And I think that actually it will be net good. I could be wrong on that, but that's my current thinking is actually the transparency and the portability enforce good behavior in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, I'm inclined to agree. I just I hope that part of it, with all these brilliant people, all these amazing engineers and founders working on this problem, I hope that one of the problems they solve is the idea of knitting all of this together somehow, right?
Yeah.
I hope that those two are not mutually exclusive, that we can have all this exploration within these ecosystems, but then also something that connects it together. Avichal and Ken, this has been an amazing discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. Obviously, it sounds like you're on the forefront and thinking deeply about these issues in a way that I think few else are. That was certainly one of the best conversations we've had. Andrew, I don't know if you agree, but really enjoyed the discussion. Where can our listeners go to find out more about what you're up to? We know for a fact we have lots of aspiring founders who listen to the show. So would love to get more information about Electric Capital.
At Electric Capital on Twitter is pretty good. Electriccapital.com. I'm at Avichal on Twitter. Ken is at Puntium, Puntium on Twitter. We're pretty accessible, pretty easy to find. And we love talking to founders. So if anybody has...
Yeah, DMs are open.
DMs are open. And actually, I would also throw out that if anybody disagrees with anything that we said, that's actually particularly interesting. Like a lot of the best insights and a lot of the best investments come from we thought the way the world worked a certain way. And then some founder comes along and says, no. Like actually the world works. Like you believe X, but actually not X is true. And if somebody can walk us through that, those are like the most phenomenal conversations. And we love having those kinds of things. So if we said anything about, like Ken talked about all the second gen DeFi stuff or, where we think value capture might be on this like U curve or any of these kinds of concepts, if you're like, no, I vehemently disagree and I can prove to you why, those are the best conversations. So we would look forward to having any of those people reach out.
All right.
Yeah. If we pissed you off, come talk to us. Basically.
It sounds like a challenge and an opportunity for folks. Thank you guys again. Really appreciate the conversation.
Likewise.
That's it for this week's episode of DeFi Decoded. I am Alex Tapscott. We've got a full slate for the next few weeks, but until then, take care and we will speak soon. Cheers.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.